Good evening, fantasy football fans. Welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Slant, brought to you by ProFootballFocus.com Fantasy. This is your typical host, Scott Spratt, joined as always by Michael Moore. Michael, how are you tonight?
I'm very typical, Scott. How are you?
Always typical, man. Well, things that aren't a little typical are there's actually an NFL game sort of over the weekend, which is the Hall of Fame game. So
I'll take it. I don't care what it is. I'll take it.
There are a lot of people in our industry that would, rather watch that than pretty much anything else on television because at least football is back. I may not be one of those people, but luckily Michael is here to actually tell you what happened where some others of us, namely me, may fail. But there's one really important story attached to the Hall of Fame game that I think we need to cover first before we get into any of the actual action and into actually what we're going to do this week, which I'll go ahead and tease as we're going to talk about number 2 wide receivers this week. So some really interesting comparisons there. So stick around for that. But as for the Hall of Fame game, Michael, I feel like we've talked about him quite a bit over the last few weeks, but David Wilson once again comes up, somewhat related to this game. He hurt his neck again, and it appears his career is over. It seems like he's going to be retiring at 23 years old, which obviously is a shame for a former number 1 overall pick. The way that this ties into the game specifically is that Andre Williams of the Giants took 7 carries for 48 yards and a touchdown in the game. And obviously for the early preseason games, really until the third week of the preseason, you have a lot of guys playing against guys that aren't necessarily first-teamers, etc. But 7 for 48 obviously is a very good performance for a first-year guy, for anyone. So is the Andre Williams hype train going to get out of control now that he seems to be the number 2 receiver on the Giants?
I don't think it's going to get out of control. I think he's definitely probably going to be overdrafted, to put it lightly, just because there's no one else there right now. I mean, yes, you have Peyton Hillis, but again, I don't know of anyone that's scared by Peyton Hillis. And look, I like Rashad Jennings by himself, but look, he's up there in age. It's not like, hey, he's a rookie or a spring chicken. So I think Williams is probably going to get a little more work now that Wilson's out. I don't see him getting more than the goal line carries that he was already ticketed for, though. So, look, I think the only thing that really changes with this Wilson news, with Williams anyway, is, look, he's now the primary backup should a Rashad Jennings go down. So, but, hey, I'm very happy if people want to start overdrafting Andre Williams. So,
are there clearly defined roles there between Jennings and Williams? Do you see Williams as the defined red zone back? Where, to me, I mean, they're both kind of big guys. I thought of them more as like a 2-series, 1-series kind of split.
Yeah, I view it more as Williams getting the goal line, like you said, the red zone running back and goal line. I think, looking at Tom Coughlin's history, he never has gone with a 3-down back. He likes to get some guys in there that can do different things. And I think he's probably headed that way with Williams. Now, they did resign Rashad Jennings to do a lot of different things, catch the ball and run between the tackles and whatnot. But I think Williams is just too raw right now to be able to be entrusted with a bigger role than they already had planned for him.
Okay, that's fair. I mean, Williams, I think, definitely does have value even in redraft formats because of the precarious nature of Rashad Jennings' health. He's never really been a featured guy, and that may be part of the reason why. But I think both guys are honestly intriguing because both of them are going to be going off as mid-20s or later running backs. Williams, hopefully much later, maybe in the 40s. But I think there's value there on the Giants. We've seen actually multiple running backs be effective for them in a redraft sense. So keep an eye on that.
I don't know if any indication or last night's any indication, but they ran the ball a lot more than they passed it. So it's still probably early to tell if that's going to be the norm for them in the regular season. But if last night's any indication, there's going to be plenty of carries to go around.
Well, your boy Eli Manning, just maybe he doesn't want to hold the ball all the time.
Scott, how dare you? How dare you?
All right, okay.
No, I don't know if it was possible, but there was a quarterback that did worse last night than Eli, and his name was E.J. Manuel. So quarterback play was not exactly stellar last night, but that's okay. It's preseason.
Did Eli even play? I assume it was the Ryan Nassib show, but I didn't.
Right.
Again, I didn't watch.
Well, and I don't know that Nassib did anything to sort of boost his stock either. So overall, it was kind of sad, but the silver lining is it's closer to real football. So.
Yeah, it's tough to have value as a backup quarterback behind Eli Manning, who I think has been the most durable player in the league over the last decade. But I'm also the guy that always drafts Ryan Mallett, so whatever.
No, one day, Scott, one day.
Okay, let's actually move on to our real topic then. We'll talk about some things that maybe actually matter in fantasy this season. And I wanted to focus this week. We've covered some wide receivers a lot lately and some second-year players, but I want to focus specifically on wide receiver twos. I'm thinking about this more from sort of a redraft perspective, but we'll hit on some dynasty opinions on this as well. But I just want to talk about, Michael, I think this year we have a group of guys that are pretty clearly the number one receivers in fantasy. And so stop me if you don't think any of these guys are number one receivers, but Calvin Johnson, A.J. Green, Demaryius Thomas, Des Bryant, Brandon Marshall, Julio Jones, and Alshon Jeffrey. That's 7 guys. I think that they sort of are a tier. Maybe you could have a sub-tier within that, but I think those 7 guys are a little bit separated from the other receivers that are available. That's definitely been the case in most ADPs. Do you see those guys as sort of a step above the guys that come after them?
Yeah, I mean, especially for dynasty purposes, I think those guys are it.
Yeah.
They're very good offenses. They've got the size, they've got the track record to be a wide receiver one. I mean, all of those guys have proven they can do it before, which I think is honestly very important before you label a guy a wide receiver one. I mean, he has to prove that he can do it. Even, the Calvin Johnsons and the Julio Jones of the world weren't wide receiver ones their rookie year. They had to sort of prove that they can do it. So, yeah, with those guys, especially in dynasty leagues, if that's my first receiver on my roster, I'd be okay with that.
Yeah, I feel like Julio Jones was considered a wide receiver one his rookie year, but not necessarily what
I. He was on the edge.
He
was on the cusp. He was on the cusp.
We'll be bringing his name up again, teaser number 2. Okay, so here's what I thought we would do today, Michael. Since we have those list of guys that we think are sort of separated, what I want to do now is actually let's just do a 2-man draft. We did that a couple of weeks ago with rookies, but I just want to go through. We can bring up the guys that we think deserve to be considered to be sort of the next tier, the wide receiver 2 guys. Try to go in the order of you think of their value, and then we can debate whether or not we agree with each other's picks. And I'm actually going to start because I'm the host and get that privilege, but also because I actually think there's another wide receiver that belongs in the first tier.
Wait, can I guess, Scott? Can I guess? Because I have a guy too.
Okay.
Are you ready?
You can guess. Go.
Well, let's play. Let's have some hints. Is he from the AFC?
No.
Oh, then I'm already out. Never mind. All right, you might as well just tell me that.
Okay. So my guy is Jordy Nelson.
Oh.
And again, I'm sort of thinking about this more as a redraft perspective. People may not realize that Nelson is 29 years old, given that he sort of had a late start to his fantasy-relevant career. But I just want to do a little bit of comparison of Nelson to Julio Jones, who's a guy that I don't think anybody ever questions as being an elite-tier guy, despite some of his injuries. But beyond just the injuries, Nelson has had the track record of success. Nelson had 85 catches for 1,314 yards and 8 touchdowns last year. That's actually one of 2 of the last 3 seasons that Nelson has done better than Julio Jones has ever done in his career. And Nelson is more than just an outside threat, too. I know he's predominantly an outside receiver, especially when Randall Cobb is on the field, but he had a 71.9% catch rate in the slot last year. That was very high. I think that was top 5 among guys that had a decent number of slot opportunities. So I think he's sort of an effective player inside and outside. He's been healthier than Julio Jones and more productive than Julio Jones. 4 years older, so especially in a dynasty sense, I totally get why Jones is considered to be the better rated player. But explain to me why Nelson doesn't belong, at least in the company of guys like Jones and maybe even Jeffrey.
I can't.
Okay.
So this will be a very short podcast.
I can't tell if I'm saying that Nelson is a first-tier guy or I'm saying that Julio Jones is not. But it's one of those 2 things. I'm kind of on the seesaw there. But I definitely think Nelson is another step up above the guys who are going to be coming after this.
Right. Okay. So a couple things. First, I agree with you, especially. Which I think, you're inherently saying that he's a better option than Randall Cobb if you're looking at Green Bay targets.
100% think that's true, and that's a pretty unusual statement. I mean, not everyone thinks that Cobb is better, but I think most people think that they're at least equal, and I think Nelson is clearly the number 1 receiver here.
Right, and I completely agree with that. The thing that really clinched it for me, and I probably would have had a different answer, even as recently as last week. But they did re-sign him over the past week, which ensures he's going to be in that system and he's going to have Aaron Rodgers for at least a couple more years. Because that was really the big thing holding me back from viewing Nelson higher in dynasty formats is, there was some question on where he's going to be next year. And, like we've seen with some other Green Bay receivers that have gone on to different places, it just doesn't seem to work out as well. But now that they re-signed him and it ensures he's going to be there for at least, beyond 2014, no, I completely agree. I mean, you got to have somebody in that Green Bay offense, at least on the receiving side, that is getting the benefits of all that Aaron Rodgers action, quite honestly. And, look, Nelson has been reliable. I mean, he's been one of those durable players, too, a lot more than Cobb, that's for sure. And I think, having a guy on the outside like that, there's always going to be a place for him. I mean, in the slot, they sort of have to be creative and move things around. And, yeah, could Cobb have a higher ceiling than Nelson this year or next? Possibly. But, like we've talked before. Well, okay.
I say no. I think Nelson has 12 to 15 touchdown upside that Cobb does not have. But I guess Cobb does have, 100 reception potential, which Nelson doesn't too.
Right. And for me, just like we've talked about before, I'm definitely a more conservative dynasty player. And Nelson, just has the track record for it. So, no, I could buy into that. If Nelson were my, if I went maybe a couple other positions first before addressing my receiver depth and Nelson was it, I think I would be okay with that.
Okay, well, good. So I guess if you were thinking AFC guys, I'll guess from your next pick too is probably Antonio Brown.
It was Antonio Brown.
Nice.
Yeah, I love the guy. I really do. I've had him the last couple of years in a couple of my home leagues, and yeah, I mean he's just first. I really like the Pittsburgh offense. I liked him last year. I like him even more this year. We've covered this before. I think they're more committed to the no huddle, which means a couple more plays per game that they should get off. And look, they had 3 receivers that were very good last year. I think even in the mock draft we did last week, I think somebody mentioned that they had 3 receivers in the top 30 fantasy-wise last year with the Steelers. So, yeah, but right. Even with all that, you still had Antonio Brown as a top 5 option. So to me, that shows that even though there's a lot of options in Pittsburgh and a lot of potential for production, Brown is still the clear-cut guy. And especially in PPR leagues, I mean, I think Ben Roethlisberger, I think Antonio Brown's probably his favorite target of his entire career if you're looking at everything. So, yeah, for me, Brown's it. And he, for me, I think, is my Jordy Nelson, Scotty. So, because I've had him as a wide receiver 1, and it worked out very well.
I think people would be stunned to realize that Brown had 110 catches, 1,443 yards, and 8 touchdowns last year. I mean,
I'm not.
He's just 26 years old, too.
Right.
He never really had the pedigree of the number 1 receivers coming up through the Steelers' offense, so I think it sort of surprised people, and it definitely surprised me, but he's done it back-to-back seasons now. It's hard to argue, and even though Nelson is the guy I prefer over him, Brown so clearly to me comes next, and after him, I have really struggled to figure out who comes next off the board. And, I mean, there have been articles on the site written about this, how it could really be one of a number of guys here.
Right.
But I'm going to take the coward's way out and pick Larry Fitzgerald here, who
All right.
is a very high floor and very, I don't want to call him a low ceiling guy, but seems like a low ceiling guy just based on the last couple of seasons.
The last couple of years, he has been a low ceiling guy. It's okay to admit that, Scott.
It's true. Although last year, it wasn't exactly a down year with 82 catches, 954 yards, and 10 touchdowns. This is sort of a weird thing, but Fitzgerald hasn't played very well the last 2 Well, he hasn't performed very well in fantasy the last 2 years. I think he's played very, very well, actually. But even though he's 30 years old now, I actually think he's a much more valuable player in dynasty formats than he is in redraft formats. I know that seems kind of strange, given that his window of opportunity is shorter than some of the guys we'll be coming up to that are still in their mid-20s. But I can't imagine Fitzgerald not being in this conversation again next year. And honestly, he's about the only guy on this list that I feel that way about. I cannot imagine Fitzgerald not being a wide receiver 2 for the next 3 years. I think he's just an exceptional talent, and he's been sort of burdened by a bad offense, one typically with a bad offensive line in Arizona, with inconsistent quarterback play, potentially with emerging wide receiver options, Michael Floyd, who we'll probably be talking about in a little bit here. But just looking at last year at Fitzgerald's numbers, 1.20 drop rate, that was the best in the league among wide receivers with basically any kind of opportunities. He's got unbelievable hands. His athleticism maybe doesn't kind of match up to some of the elite number 1 receivers, but I think the consistency is there. I don't worry about him at all. And if I have one of the elite guys, then I just feel like I'm not screwing up by picking Fitzgerald.
Yeah, I could see that. For me, especially in dynasty formats, the big thing for me is going to be the quarterback play. Carson Palmer he's up there, quite honestly. And
Yes.
And even though he did play all 16 games last year, it's not like I suddenly feel better about Carson Palmer's health all of a sudden. So.
Sure.
Look, and there's no denying Fitzgerald's one of the all-time greats. I mean, no one's doubting his resume or his ability, but as the years go on, he's going to become more reliant on the guys around him, and that's really the concern for me is making sure that there's guys around him that can support him and take some of the heat off of him because he's going to need it here pretty soon. But to your point, I think if you had to draft a lower end wide receiver too, and you had Larry Fitzgerald, I mean, looking at that roster, I don't think anyone can deny you that guy. So, I may not be as high on him as you are, especially in dynasty formats, but I'm still not going to say he's to wide receiver 3 level yet. That makes sense.
Just ballpark it. How many receivers that we haven't named would you draft ahead of Fitzgerald in a redraft league?
Oh, in a redraft league.
5, 10.
Yeah,
2?
if that. No, I would say it's closer to 5 than 10.
Okay.
I'd say it's closer to 5 than 10. Which I've done. I've drafted Larry Fitzgerald as my second receiver, and it's kind of funny. He'll have games where he gets 2 catches for 20 yards, but then he'll have very big games because he's Larry Fitzgerald. That's what he does. So yeah, and I think as a wide receiver too, I don't think you can ask for a whole lot more than just the potential that he is a wide receiver 1 most weeks.
Okay, you are up again.
Oh God. Okay. Ooh. So if we're going dynasty, I would probably go. Oh man, I got 2 guys in mind, but I'm not going to tell you the other guy. I'd probably go Keenan Allen here. I'd be okay with that as my wide receiver too. He's the number 1 receiver on a like we've talked about before, a pretty efficient offense. We covered him, I think, at length last week with our tiered or our receivers there. He finished 10th in fantasy scoring last year. He's a young guy. It's only his second year. If he were my second receiver, especially, like I said, especially in dynasty formats, I think I'd be thrilled with that.
I like Allen. We've sort of talked about him and some of the other second-year guys a lot in the last couple of weeks, so I'm not going to really expound upon him too much. But given that he's 22 years old, I think he's sort of a no-brainer, especially in dynasty formats. And yeah, I think that's pretty clear. So I'll just kind of move on from there. The next guy on my list is Pierre Garçon, who's actually a little bit older than you might think at 27 years old. But I mean, that's still fairly young for a dynasty player, especially when you're looking against guys like maybe Roddy White and Andre Johnson at this range. Garçon has definitely a year's advantage there. And I think would probably also surprise people with how productive he was last year with 113 catches for 1,346 yards and 5 touchdowns. He actually led the league in receptions. And, he's actually, I think bringing in Deshaun Jackson, it works really well because there's sort of a complementary set here. Garçon had a 19% drop rate on deep balls, was one of the worst in the league, doesn't really stretch the field the way he did back when he was on Peyton Manning's old Colts teams. So I actually think that Garçon makes more sense as the sort of the heavily targeted guy in the slot, whereas Jackson can sort of make it easier on Garçon there. And I also question whether Griffin actually has accuracy on those deep balls. So I feel like it's sort of a better fit in the offense for him. I think he'll be a very productive player for the Redskins again this season.
Yeah, I can't really fault you for that. I may be one of the few guys. I don't think his value is going to be hurt a whole lot by Deshaun Jackson. I mean, sure, is there going to be targets that not go his way? Yeah, but like you said, it's not like Garçon was the deep option in Washington anyway. So, it's not like Jackson is sort of encroaching on his territory. They're still going to go to Garçon, over the middle, within 5 yards, all that stuff. So, yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't have a problem with that, especially in dynasty formats. He's, like you said, he's 27. I think he probably, not wasted away, but sort of spent some time in Indy hanging out before he finally broke out. So, but yeah, if he's your wide receiver too, especially in PPR formats, I think you could do a lot worse than that. So
definitely.
For me, I would probably go, and this this might or might not be a surprise to you, Scotty, but I would go Vincent Jackson here as my wide receiver too. I think for me, he is one of the most underrated guys in all of fantasy football. I mean, he performed in San Diego, and people I think chalk that up to playing with Phillip Rivers and and quite honestly, being the long ball threat, a la Deshaun Jackson in Philadelphia. But then he went to Tampa. And even with some sketchy quarterback play there, still performed at a high level. I mean, he's finished in the top 15 amongst fantasy receivers the last 2 years there. So, quite honestly, I think they probably improved their offense a little bit, even immediately. I mean, they brought in McCown, who proved last year that he's very efficient at throwing the ball up to his tall receivers and seeing who comes down with it. And that's what Vincent Jackson does, quite honestly. And could some of his targets be taken away by a guy like Evans? Maybe, but I also think, especially this first year, there's going to be a lot of growing pains for Evans, and I think Jackson's still going to be the number one target there. So for me, Vincent Jackson would be my pick.
It's hard to be too concerned about the quarterback play in Tampa, considering that Jackson has had at least 72 catches, 1,200 yards, and 7 touchdowns the last 2 seasons in Tampa with some of the mess that they've trotted out of the position. So I think you have to feel like either Glennon or McCown. Why do I always forget McCown's name? God, because he's totally forgettable, I guess. But either way, I mean, I feel like Jackson's pretty safe from that perspective. In the long run, I think that he's maybe a bit of a risk for the touchdowns to decline, just given how much size they've added there in Tampa. But I agree, it's not a concern for me this year. 31 years old, I'm not really concerned about a decline there. Okay, next up on my list. God, these are so many of these guys are so close together for me, and we're going to touch on whether or not it's worth taking these guys where they're going in ADP in a little bit. But I think I'm going to have to, again, side with the veteran here with Andre Johnson, even though he's 33 years old, and even though his teammate is my favorite value in fantasy right now. But, I mean, it's hard to knock what Johnson has been doing. 109 catches for 1,407 yards and 5 touchdowns last season. So he was the number 10 receiver in PPR formats last year, and he basically has had, I think, 5 100-plus catch seasons in the last 7 or so. When he's healthy, he catches a ton of balls. I just don't think the touchdown upside is there. He still hasn't scored 10 times in a season in his career, and I don't think it's going to happen this year either. But the safety there with the catches is just unbelievable for Johnson. And I actually think the Texans are going to be a nice rebound team this season all around. So I like most of the players on their team as value picks. And, I mean, this is obviously a redraft pick here, but I definitely like Johnson to have another successful season this year.
I really can't agree with that, or I really can't argue with that. When you look at last year and the abysmal quarterback play that Houston had, whether it was Matt Schaub or Case Keenum or even T.J. Yates, I think saw some time last year.
Former North Carolina Tar Heel legend.
There you go. Right, and to have Johnson finish 10th despite that, I think is just very impressive, quite honestly. And look. There was some drama this year. There was some talk of him wanting to be traded and sort of forcing his hand, but I don't think I don't think his play is going to drop off this year. And I think, look, I know he was kind of mopey going into the season because it looks like another rebuilding job there, but I like Bill O'Brien personally. I think and he's an offensive mind, so I don't think you can necessarily throw the towel on him yet. And like you said, I think there's going to be a lot of people that pick them to rebound this year and certainly do better than they did last year. So, I don't find a lot of fault in that. I mean, I maybe the age, but at the same time, he did it last year when he was 32. So what's to say he couldn't do it again this year at 33?
Well, there you go. All right, you're up.
Oh God. Okay. Oh God, I'm gonna get eviscerated for this. I know it, but
there are 2 guys that if you pick that I'm just gonna rail on you for, just so you know.
Is one of them a white guy?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. I would probably go Eric Decker here, to the shock of many people. And believe me, it's not a sexy pick. It's not like I would, go out and buy my Eric Decker jersey. But, I think there's a lot to like with Decker. I mean, obviously he performed at a high level with Peyton Manning throwing passes to him. But I think you also got to look at the year before when he had Tim Tebow for most of the season, and he still performed at an above-average level. And certainly not the level he did with Peyton Manning, but he was still good. And look, there's something to be said about being a wide receiver one in an offense, which is what what the Jets signed him to do. And look, all indications are so far anyway that Geno Smith looks better than last year, and he did show some flashes in some games last year of being a competent, above-average quarterback. So, for me now, would I take him in front of any of the guys we talked about? No, certainly not, obviously. But if we're getting down to this sort of level, and I need to fill out that wide receiver 2 spot, I think I would be okay with Decker. So let me have it, Scott, please. I know it's coming.
This wasn't one of the guys that I was gonna really come against you with, but I'm not gonna lie that I didn't actually write Eric Decker's name down as a consideration.
Even better.
So yeah, it's a really big deal to be the number 1 receiver on a team, much like Santonio Holmes was on this very team last season.
He
right?
was. Look at him go.
I mean, in your defense, Decker had a tremendous year last year. I think he was a top 5 player in PPR formats as well. And I think Decker, like many wide receivers, gets unfairly pegged as being an unathletic player when, in fact, he's very athletic and stacks up against a lot of players. So I definitely could see him having a big season, but even as much positive things I've written about Geno Smith and Michael Vick in this offseason, I just don't see him matching up with some of the other players that I have coming up. I thought you were going to say Wes Welker, actually, but
oh, God, no. No,
that's okay.
No, we're good.
So let me move on to another guy, Randall Cobb. Again, he is not my favorite player. He actually doesn't.
Talk about him.
He doesn't have a track record of success. He doesn't have 1,000 yards in a season in his career. But I feel like when you are on Aaron Rodgers' team, and especially when you're playing in the slot, and you can probably be the only guy on your team that's going to get 90-plus catches in a healthy season, I think it's hard to bet against Cobb from that perspective. And he's a lot bigger than many slot receivers, so I don't think it's necessarily a doomed like the way Kendall Wright, for instance, has only had a handful of touchdowns the last 2 seasons. I don't really see Cobb as being locked into that for certain. So I can definitely see like a 90 for 1,208 season very easily from Cobb this season. And health is really the only concern I think you have there in Green Bay's offense. So I think Cobb makes a lot of sense here, especially given the uncertainty of many of the other options you have at this point.
Yeah, I think if you're getting towards this, sort of the bottom of the wide receiver 2 barrel, I'm okay with that. I mean, I think it's a decent risk. I will say I never understood people that pegged him as a wide receiver 1, or even in dynasty leagues, you'll see a lot of rankings that have him in the top 10, and I don't understand it. I mean, there's way more uncertainty with him than I think things to like. I mean, like you said, he's got an injury history that's pretty, profound at this point. And look, for me, I'm big into where they're going to be next year if I'm doing a dynasty league, and he's not re-signed yet in Green Bay, and it's not a certainty that he's going to be there next year. And I think he's the kind of guy that if you take him out of Green Bay, just like a lot of other receivers before, I don't know that he has the same opportunity as he did. So yeah, I think if he's your wide receiver 2, it's a decent risk, but anything above that, I think you're just asking for trouble. So. Yeah, I think I'm okay with that.
Okay, very gracious. All right, Michael, go ahead.
All right, so this is the 10th guy in this sort of mini mock draft. I think we'll round out 10 guys. I think that's a good number.
Okay.
So you said there were 2 guys you were gonna hit.
The landmines.
Right, and you already named one, so I'm gonna guess the other.
Welker was not one of the landmines.
Oh my God. Okay, so there's something out there. Is he in the NFC? Is one of them in the NFC?
Yes.
Is one of them in the NFC West?
Yes.
Oh, I got 2 guys. I'm going to say, I would take Crabtree.
Oh, that was definitely one of the 2.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead and explain why you like him, and then I'll tell you why I don't.
It was either that or Harvin, quite honestly. For Crabtree, look, and as as previous listeners have probably seen or heard, actually, I'm a 49er fan, so I like to think I know a little bit more about their fantasy players than most other teams. Crabtree's a very good receiver. He's got exceptional hands, and look, has he been in an offense the past couple of years that was conducive to fantasy production? Certainly not. I just saw a stat today that I think said him and Vernon Davis have accounted for exactly 80% of Colin Kaepernick's targets, and which tells me that hey, he's not throwing he's not throwing it a lot, because it's not like Kaepernick, or it's not like Crabtree and Davis are exactly lighting the world on fire fantasy-wise. But I'm hoping, and I would bet on this, that the 49ers realize that they can open it up a little bit. They've got the personnel to do that. They traded for Stevie Johnson this year. And I think, look, they're not blind. They can see the Frank Gores of the world getting up there too. And I think they realize, hey, we've got this quarterback in Kaepernick. We just signed to a big deal. Let's try to squeeze a little more out of him. And I'm hoping, and I'm thinking that means they're going to put the ball in his hands a little more. And I think Crabtree is probably going to be the main beneficiary of that. But with all that said, let me have it, Scott. Go ahead.
Okay, tell me if you think any of this is unfair. So
Okay.
Michael Crabtree, 26 years old, has been in the league 5 seasons.
Unfair.
Unfair so far? He's had one season with at least 900 yards receiving out of 5.
I remember that. It was a magical season.
It was a magical season. It was in the same season that he had, I think, 9 touchdowns, but he's only had 7+ touchdowns in that one season. So really, you're kind of banking on one season of success with Crabtree. We've already, to a certain extent, talked about exactly how much they've added at all the skill position players, I think, making it very crowded. And to me, a lot of the overlap there is actually toward the middle of the field, where Stevie Johnson comes in and competes as well. Vernon Davis is the guy that I see as the one player that really stretches the field vertically. That's not really in Crabtree's game. So I just feel like the overlap there is kind of damaging. And I'm glad that you brought up Percy Harvin, who, by the way, is not someone that I'm advocating. I just want to do a little basic comparison there, because Percy Harvin is also 26 years old and also debuted the same season as Crabtree in 2009. People probably realize that Harvin has only managed to play 10 games the last 2 seasons combined. He still has more receptions, more total yards, and more touchdowns than Crabtree in his career after barely playing the last 2 seasons. Deshaun Jackson, 27 years old, so he's been in the league 1 year longer than Michael Crabtree. Here's what Crabtree would need to do this year to catch up to Deshaun Jackson's career numbers. He would need 2,488 receiving yards and 13 touchdowns this year. He would be the number one receiver. He would be the number one receiver if he managed that. But
yeah, I think there's
infuriated owners for not doing much most seasons, and that's how far behind the pace Crabtree is.
Right. I think he's got a shot to do that, Scott. I think he's right in line for a 2,500-yard season. So
I say under.
Yeah. But for me, I go back to and look, it's not like I can deny anything you said. It's all factually correct. But I think, just like we talked about, you're getting to the bottom tier of these wide receiver 2s, and look, there's going to be risk with any of them. I mean, that's why they're wide receiver 2s, quite honestly. And I think when you get to this point, a big factor is what's their ceiling, quite honestly. What are they capable of doing? And for me, I think Crabtree has the makings of a wide receiver 1. Now, I don't know that he's in an offense necessarily that's going to be conducive to that, but do I think he could at least be a wide receiver 2 for a lot of teams? Yeah, I really do. And look, he has an injury history himself, and yes, you're right. It's not like he has necessarily the track record, but I think with the skill and with the talent around him, I think the possibility is high there. That's all I'll say.
What I think we're really sort of saying with a lot of this is you and I come at this at a fairly similar angle. We both play a lot of dynasty leagues, so we think about things in that sense. But we're having a lot of disagreements here about players and where they sort of stack up against each other in the wide receiver 2 range. And beyond the 10 named players that we named, here are just the other guys that I wrote down that I think deserve consideration at least as wide receiver 2s. Michael Floyd, Cordero Patterson. I wrote DeAndre Hopkins, and I know I'm the only one that thinks that, but whatever. T.Y. Hilton, Deshaun Jackson, Percy Harvin, Sammy Watkins, some people think maybe belongs in that range. I don't, but still. Victor Cruz, Roddy White. I mean, Roddy White had 80-plus receptions, 1,150-plus yards, and 6-plus touchdowns 6 straight seasons before last year. And obviously he was hurt last year. I mean, we all knew that. So are we done with him completely? Got Wes Welker, Torrey Smith, Kendall Wright. They're all of these players, Michael, and I think for me the lack of differentiation in my own mind, and 2, the lack of general consensus on what the correct order is there, sort of makes me devalue that entire set of players relative to other positions. And I kind of wanted to get your opinion about that, Michael. Let's see, I pulled up the ADP here, and I think we kind of both agreed that Antonio Brown and Jordy Nelson were a little bit apart from these guys. They're going off as the 16th and 24th players in my fantasy league ADP right now. But then after that, there's sort of a range of these guys. Like Keenan Allen's going 27th, but then you can drop down and see T.Y. Hilton's going 49th, and Roddy White's going 55th, and Torrey Smith 57th. Are you just kind of waiting for the guys that you want to fall, or like how are you sort of tackling this from a team building strategy?
Sure. Well, and you sort of bring up, I think what we were getting to next, which was where do you look at these guys relative to the rest of your team? And I go back to I wrote an article last week that sort of looked at which positions are the most consistent on a year-to-year basis, which I think is very important for Dynasty. I mean, you need to determine, hey, if I'm making an investment in this position, is it going to come back to haunt me in the long run? And the clear-cut winner for most turnover year over year was wide receiver, which, was honestly a little surprising to me. I probably would have beforehand guessed running backs had the most turnover, but without a doubt it was wide receivers. I think there was one receiver that finished in the top 20 fantasy-wise for at least 4 years. And there's a lot of factors that go into it, and quite honestly, there's a lot of stuff for receivers that they don't control. I mean, even the most talented guys can't control if they're going to get the ball or if they're going to be double covered or whatever. So for me, unless you have two, maybe wide receiver one sitting at the top of your board in the first 2 to 3 rounds, I'm probably looking, quite honestly, to fill out the rest of my team before I go and get a lot of these other guys. Does that make sense?
It does, because I've sort of been building my teams in the same way. Typically in the first round, I'm going to select one of the elite running backs if I have that option. So one of the McCoys, Charleses, Petersons, Fortes, Lacey's. I really want to grab one of those guys in the first round, but I would consider one of the elite tier receivers then in the next round if one dropped to me, maybe like a Marshall or Jeffrey if I can get that there. Because then I think I can really grab a quality running back in the third round when a lot of guys are sort of grabbing the first names off of this list, whereas I don't really have a strong preference there, and they may be grabbing the guys that I don't even prefer. But like, look at this. Arian Foster is going off as the 28th overall player here, so one pick after Keenan Allen. I'm definitely going to prefer Arian Foster, who I see as having top 5 potential in overall, compared to Allen. Like, how much do I like Allen 2 rounds ahead of Andre Johnson this year? I mean, frankly, I don't. And I think the consensus order of running backs is so much more on point. We're starting with Foster there at 28th. We jump down to Zach Stacy at 30th. We have C.J. Spiller at 34th, Andre Ellington at 36th. These guys I think are sort of in the correct order and critical grabs, because 2 rounds later, all of a sudden you're looking at Ben Tate and Trent Richardson as your running back, and I don't want that to happen to me. I'm fine if Ray Rice is my number 4 running back, so if it works out, it's great. But to me, I don't want to risk sort of having to dip down to that level when instead I could be drafting Kendall Wright right there as my number 2 or number 3 wide receiver. I just don't think it makes any sense to build your team that way, just given the relative differences from the positions.
Right. No, and I agree, and I think it holds for redraft or dynasty leagues. I mean, there's just a lot of turnover at the receiver position. There just is, and like you said, there's just a cluster of guys in that middle tier that you could get in the later rounds, and he could do just as good as some of these wide receiver ones we were talking about based on the situation. So yeah, no, I agree. I think there's a huge drop off in running backs after the guys like you said, like the Ellingtons of the world. I think if you're hoping that you can get by with maybe like like you said, a Ben Tate or a Trent Richardson as your running back 2, over a guy like Roddy White or Andre Johnson as your receiver 2, I think you got another thing coming.
Beyond that, I kind of feel like the later round wide receiver sleepers are a lot more, I don't even know what the word is. I'm going to say obvious, but clearly not obvious because they're going off later in rounds. But, I mean, I really want to target guys like DeAndre Hopkins, Terrence Williams, Justin Hunter, those type of players as my later round sleeper picks because I feel very good about their chances to break out. Whereas among the running back sleepers, I mean, I have guys that I prefer, but to me, a lot of those guys are going to get opportunities based on injuries, and that's just going to become a waiver wire fight because you're not going to really have the perception now to say, oh yeah, let me grab Andre Williams because I know that Rashad Jennings is the running back that's starting that's going to get hurt. Right. That's just kind of guesswork, and with the wide receivers, I feel like it's better to take those risks later on, whereas that could really sort of complement your number one receivers if they're not quite as strong. I really want the strong top end running backs this season, though. I mean, like every year probably, but it's just the way it falls in my mind.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the other positions are just too important to ignore. I mean, in most leagues, you'll have one quarterback, and even in the two quarterback leagues, it's probably more important to get your two quarterbacks than your second receiver. And of course, most leagues have one tight end. I mean, barring a flex position type deal. So. Yeah, I think it's more critical to even get those positions filled up first before going off and get another receiver.
In a two quarterback league, I would definitely be grabbing quarterbacks, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But in a one quarterback league, if it's shallower, to a certain extent, I'm not sure, because I feel like both Cam Newton and Tom Brady are available very late in those formats. Right. And that's maybe just a consensus ranking difference that I have, that I like those players so much. But it's definitely true for me with the wide receiver running back comparison.
Right.
Wow, that took a lot of time, but I think we need to keep going and have sort of a long show today, Michael, because there's one more point that I think we really want to touch on, and it's what I call a peak level comparison. And I know we do sort of hopping around redraft and dynasty a lot on this show, but one thing that I think we do a bad job of, and many people do a bad job of, is actually comparing what we think the long-term potential, like the best season potential is of players that may not be on the same schedule. So the example that I emailed to you previously, Michael, was like compare Michael Floyd to Cordero Patterson to Sammy Watkins. So those are high draft picks for 3 consecutive seasons. If you're looking at this season only, I mean, in my mind, I think it's pretty clear that Michael Floyd is the one that you expect to be the best. That's true for me at least. But it's not true for me that I think Floyd's best season will be better than Patterson's best season and better than Watkins' best season. So for guys that maybe you're thinking more long-term, let's talk just a little bit about how we feel some of these guys stack up from a top-level potential standpoint.
Okay.
And maybe we'll start with those 3 players, Michael. How would you sort of gauge Floyd versus Patterson versus Watkins over the long term? So in their best fantasy season, who would you draft?
This is
really hard for me, by the way.
And this may just be this may be recency bias, but I would probably go Watkins if we're talking about those 3 guys. I think Watkins has and we covered it even offline just before we started here. Watkins is in the conversation for wide receiver 2 in a lot of leagues, but as far as best season goes, I think there's a lot of people expecting him to sort of be in that Julio Jones type class, and I think he could probably do it. Now, is it going to be this year? Definitely not. Is it going to be any year that E.J. Manuel's quarterback? Probably not. But do I think he's capable of it at his peak? Yeah, I think he is. So if we're talking about those 3 guys, I would probably take Watkins. What about you?
For me, it's Patterson. I kind of feel like Patterson offers the best of both worlds in that he's just so crazy fast that he can obviously play the slot and grab those sort of short outlet passes and take them the distance. But he's big. I mean, you don't really see that from guys that play in the interior of the field. And speaking of Watkins specifically, Watkins is not big. He's over 6 foot. He's maybe 6'1" or 6'2", but he's only like 205. That's a lot smaller than the prototypical elite wide receiver, like the Alshon Jeffrey kind of body that you would expect from a number 1 type receiving talent. And so I worry about Watkins long term from a health perspective, and I'm going to be really curious to see exactly how the Bills line him up against some of the other options they have on their team that, frankly, are bigger players. I mean, Watkins is obviously the most talented receiver they have there, but I just have some uncertainty about how they're going to use him. And not that I'm suggesting that there's like a Tavon Austin season coming from Watkins this year. I don't believe that at all.
God, I hope not.
Patterson has such a clear role to me that I'm not worried at all about his level of production. And I really think that he has the speed and size combo that makes him sort of an exceptional player that I'm just not sure that Watkins is on that level.
Sure. Well, and it's funny because you said you asked the rhetorical question, who would you take this year out of those 3? I would take Patterson, quite honestly, for this year over Floyd. I think all the indications are they're just going to feed him the ball, and like you said, he's got ridiculous talent, and it's not just he's not just sort of a Deshaun Jackson one-dimensional guy where hey he does one thing but he does it really well. I think Patterson has the capability to do a lot of things really well. I mean, underneath, outside. And his yards after catch are just, they're exceptional. They're just exceptional. And I think when you pair him with a guy like Norv Turner, who, is probably my favorite offensive coordinator in the NFL, I think there's going to be a lot to like with Patterson this year. And for me, it's like I said, long term, it's a slight edge with Watkins because I think he's probably a more complete player. But yeah, I'm just as high on Patterson though.
So I think I intuit then that you, like me, don't think that Floyd belongs on their tier or their class in terms of long-term potential.
For dynasty purposes, no. For me, no. He would be clearly a notch below those guys.
I think of Floyd as a wide receiver 2 now and always, kind of. Right. I don't see the number 1 upside the way that I do with Patterson and Watkins. Michael, you have other maybe comparisons here? I didn't do like a lot of research here, so I'm curious if you had other guys that you thought of.
Yeah, all right. So I will give you a comparison, and you could sort of you can give me your thoughts on it. So 2012, and we'll go the one from each of the last 3 years like you just did. So 2012, we got Alshon Jeffrey, who was part of that class. 2013, just because I know you love him, I'm going to give you DeAndre Hopkins.
I love him.
And 2014, who do I want? We'll go Mike Evans. This will be interesting. So you got Jeffrey versus Hopkins versus Evans. So let's do 2 things. One this season only, and then the other would be long-term dynasty-esque sort of prospects.
For me, it's a no-brainer that Jeffrey, both for this year and the long term, is the clear guy. I don't care how good of a prospect you are. If I've already seen what Jeffrey did last season, then I'm going to give you the edge.
Sure.
Like, if I had saw somebody with Calvin Johnson's abilities in this year's draft class, I would still take Jeffrey over him because I think they're just things that sometimes don't always translate as well. And to me, Jeffrey's just proven it in a way that those other guys haven't. So to me, he's the clear choice for the first pick here. After that, it gets really tough because, I was mentioning about my sort of fear of lack of size, and Hopkins really isn't as huge as you might expect him to be, but I just really love his leaping ability. I think that he's going to be a touchdown monster in that offense, especially next to Andre Johnson, who, by the way, is bigger, which I think is kind of something that people forget about. But I don't, even though Hopkins isn't as big as Johnson, I think that he will be the better touchdown target.
Okay.
So I think Hopkins, the fact that he's going to have the bigger short-term success is clearly why I like him more in both redraft and dynasty leagues. But I kind of think I still like Hopkins more in the long term too over Evans, which I think is probably not what the consensus opinion would be. What do you think?
I think it's pretty close. I think right now, I think the Mike Evans hype train is probably at its peak at this point. But we talked about Hopkins last week when we looked at the second-year receivers. He had a quietly productive season, even though he was in a universally bad offense. And I think if you have improved play there, which they do have, both on the offensive line and hopefully quarterback play, I think that can only mean his arrows pointing up. So. I wouldn't have a problem with that. And look, Hopkins is very good just in his own right. And look, Andre Johnson's got to retire, I think, one day. So he'll be the number 1 guy here soon enough. So, yeah, I can see that. I wouldn't have a problem with it. For me, I think I don't want to say Evans has bust potential. I think it's kind of weird to me to not see one negative thing yet about Evans. But I also haven't seen one, good thing since the draft. Is that kind of scary? I haven't seen anything. It's sort of just been, he's there, and he was, drafted 7th overall, but that's it. It's not he's, taking over camp, or, they're really excited. I mean, if you look at any of these other rookie receivers, you'll find some blurb about, Brandon Cooks looks good, or, hey, Jordan Matthews is lighting it up. I personally haven't seen it with Evans. Now, that doesn't mean it's not going to happen, but it concerns me that I haven't heard it yet. I mean, is that being paranoid?
I don't know. From a fantasy sense, I love when there's silence. Right. I'm already scared to death because everywhere I turn now, I see people talking up my boy DeAndre Hopkins. So I'm worried that the value is not going to persist.
You started that, Scott. You started that.
I think I am the Bannerman there. I think that's true. But I'm not worried about the silence as much as I would be worried about negative reports.
Sure.
Because sometimes things you might not be clued in on in terms of, I think of this more from a running back perspective, but the players that come in that don't understand the blocking schemes that they're going to have to do in the NFL, sometimes you assume because of their production at college that they can just step in and step forward with that. And less worried about that with receivers, but still, the silence doesn't bother me as much as negative reports.
Okay, that's fair, and that's completely fair. So,
Yeah. All
all
right.
right.
Well, we've almost made it to the hour mark, Michael. Did you want to talk any more there, or should we just call it an evening?
Uh, I'll give you one more.
Give me
Okay,
one more. All
for
right.
the sort of lower tier. Okay, so for 2012, I'm gonna take T.Y. Hilton for
Mm-hmm.
2012. For 2013, I'm gonna take ooh, I'll take Aaron Dobson because we've talked about him before.
Okay.
And then for 2013, I'll probably take Brandon Cooks because I think he's probably universally next in line. So Hilton versus Dobson versus Cooks. This year, who do you have?
This year, I think it's pretty clearly Hilton.
Okay.
So Hilton last year had 82 catches, 1,083 yards, and 5 touchdowns. He was actually very effective both inside and out with a 42.3% catch rate on deep balls, the 4th best in the league. People think of him as a downfield threat. He's a smaller, faster guy. But he also had a 76.7% catch rate in the slot. That was actually 2nd best among qualifiers. So, I mean, I feel like Hilton can sort of do it all. And even though there seems like there's a lot of guys on Indianapolis right now, I'm not really sure any of them measure up to Hilton. And you know that you have to love the quarterback situation there long term. So even though the pedigree isn't quite there with Hilton the way it is with the other guys, I think I'm going to go with Hilton there this year and long term.
Okay.
Dobson's upside is great, and I agree, but the drops just scare me to death. So I don't think I love to have him as a sleeper outside of my top 100 players in a redraft league this year when I don't have to count on him at all. But I don't think I could take him in a sort of a dynasty format ahead of guys like Brandon Cooks, for instance, who
Sure.
I have much fewer concerns about long term. So to me, it's Hilton, Cooks, and then a pretty clear step down to the Dobson range.
Yeah, and I'd probably agree with that. Yeah, for Hilton, yeah, it was a big blow this year when they when they brought in Nix. Like you said, I don't think necessarily Nix is going to be shutting Hilton down. I mean, everything I've seen has said that Wayne and Hilton are still the top guys, or at least running with the starters in training camp. So for Cooks, I don't know. I like Cooks probably more so than the average guy. I mean, I think he's in obviously a very good offense, and I think he's going to step in, right away. So yeah, I can't really fault you for the rank you got. I think Hilton long term is probably going to be pretty good. And hey, like you said, he's got Andrew Luck, and he's on turf. I mean, those two things together is going to be probably a pretty good thing.
All right, Michael. Well, I think we may squeeze this in just under an hour, so I hope everyone stuck with us this week. This was another episode of the Fantasy Slant, powered by ProFootballFocus.com. Next week, I probably won't be here, so you'll have to join Michael with whoever else we bring in, maybe Joey Cardilano, but always bringing good stuff with the Dynasty content and redraft content on the show. So thanks again for being with us on the show, and we'll talk to you next week.